This is State of Pennsylvania.
Welcome to the State of Pennsylvania. My name is Tom Cura, and I will be your moderator for tonight's program. Marcellus Shale. Controversy is an understatement when it comes to the Marcellus Shale play. Who's leased? Who's not leased? Who's trying to get a lease signed? Who doesn't want to lease their land? Who's having great experiences leasing their land? And who's not having? Who's having bad experiences leasing their land? What townships love it and why do some townships hate it? Some say it's great for the economy. Others say it's terrible for the environment. The list goes on and on and on. Is history going to repeat itself in the same way the coal industry left our region in environmental shambles? Will Pennsylvania get it right this time? Here with us tonight to discuss this issue is John Quigley, principal of John H. Quigley, LLC. He serves as a strategic advisor for Citizens for Pennsylvania's Future, which is Penn Future. He served as Secretary of Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources under Governor Rendell. Attorney Jordan Yeager. Jordan is a partner with Bucks County law firm Curtin and Hefner. He advises municipal governments, community associations, nonprofits, individual property owners in connection with land use and environmental matters, including issues related to zoning, gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale formation. And attorney Jeff Zimmerman. Jeff has been practicing environmental law for over 38 years. He was first practicing with the U.S. District Attorney's, the U.S. Department of Justice and Land and Natural Resource Division. In August 2007, Jeff opened up his own firm and since then has been representing clients involved in renewable fuels, brownfield redevelopments, environmental land use, regulation, contaminated site remediation, and water law. We welcome your calls and your emails, the numbers at the bottom of your screen. John, I'd like to start with you. What do you think? You think Pennsylvania is going down the same track we went down with the coal industry? Do you think it's going to be better?
Well, I think it's too early to say. Pennsylvania's history has been punctuated by waves of resource extraction, whether it was Drake in 1859 drilling the first oil well in Titusville, and we surrendered a whole swath of the state to that industry. Later on in that century, we timbered over the northern tier of Pennsylvania. Millions of acres were flattened to fuel the early days of the Industrial Revolution. And then, of course, there was king coal, soft coal in the southwest, and of course here at home in northeastern Pennsylvania, anthracite coal. In each case, Pennsylvania got it wrong. We privatized profit and we socialized cost. And we left, in the wake of those waves of extraction, tremendous environmental damage, communities that were victims of a boom and bust cycle that were left impoverished. In my own case, growing up in Hazleton, I was told from the time I was this high, get your education and get out, because there's nothing here for you. And my idea of a forest was scrub birch trees, the dirt was black, and the water that ran in streams was orange from acid mine drainage pollution. So certainly Pennsylvania has ample history to draw upon to make sure that we get this Marcellus play right. In my judgment, the Marcellus play will dwarf all of those previous waves of resource extraction combined.
Why?
So because it underlays 2/3 of the state. First of all, it is much more vast in terms of the extent of the play. It encompasses 2/3 of the land area of the state. As we sit here tonight, probably a quarter of the land area of Pennsylvania, at least 7 million acres, has been leased by the natural gas industry. So we are going to see over the next 20 or 30 years, thousands of miles of roads cut and pipelines laid, probably close to 20,000 miles of pipelines laid between gathering lines and transmission lines. We're going to see Pennsylvania's forest fragmented in a very significant way. We're going to see demands on our water supply. We're going to see demands and stresses placed on air, on communities' quality of life. It is going to change the face of Penn's woods. And we have to make sure that we recognize the perils. We also have to make sure, in my judgment, that we recognize the possible benefits and strive for the win-win. There is a way for Pennsylvania to get it right, and that's what we want to talk about.
So we want to talk about win-win. And Jordan, how do you see it?
Well, I mean, I think there are three main things that we have to keep in mind. The first is this is an inherently dangerous activity. What we're doing is drilling a mile deep, and we are going to an area that is not natural for us to be going. And there's a lot of attention given to fracking, and there's a lot of dangers associated with fracking. But simply by drilling the well, we are disrupting the Earth's core, and we are creating pathways for not just methane, but for radioactive material to mix with our drinking water. The contamination rate that we're seeing at this point in the state is 5.7%. That means that we're seeing water contamination, not just from the drilling, but also from the way the earth is being disturbed. We're seeing water contamination basically at the rate of once every 17 wells that's drilled. And we haven't even seen that get going fully statewide. So we're dealing with an inherently dangerous activity on the one hand. Secondly, the important thing to keep in mind is that the dangers that we're dealing with really go to the core of our existence. If we don't have drinking water, if we don't have water for the rest of our industries to use, our society as a whole is genuinely threatened. And while it's very important to recognize what we're looking at in terms of energy resources, water is a central resource of life. And when we think about the future wars, we're going to be looking at water wars. And we have to think about our water resources just like we think about our energy resources. And we're putting those at grave risk. The third thing I think we have to keep in mind is that when we're dealing with these things, we ought to put science first. And the way our policies have been going, we've been putting politics first. We've had $2 million spent by the oil and gas industry in the last election cycle in 2010. We ought to take a break. We ought to do the science. We ought to make sure, as John says, that we're in a position to be able to do it right. And science can lead the way in that. But we're not letting science lead right now.
Okay, thank you. Jeff?
Well, I'd like to come back to John's comments and point out that he made a great case for doing a programmatic environmental impact statement to put the science first in this case and look at what the possible impacts are going to be of this build-out in the Marcellus play. If we don't do it that way, we're going to go down the same path that John mentioned that we did with coal. If natural gas is that much cleaner of a fuel, then let's find that out. Let's know what the impacts are going to be. But when you look at communities in Pennsylvania that already have been impacted, like Bradford County, you begin to hear and see the full scope of the problems we're talking about. These are people's lives that are at stake here, their public health, their drinking water, and their clean air. Somewhere somebody should be paying attention to the constitutional provisions in the Pennsylvania Constitution, guaranteeing a right to clean air and clean water.
There are people that really are for this, regardless of the impacts. I mean, there's people that have leased land, there's communities that are for it, there's counties that are for it.
And my response to that would be, let them live for a week without clean air and clean water and see how they feel at the end of the week.
But what's different, I think what's different in the coal industry and what's happening in the natural gas industry is that the coal industry owned most of those mineral rights. The coal industry itself, meaning they own the mineral rights under the ground. In this situation, you have individual landowners that are owning the rights. Is that correct, John? So that kind of changes the dynamic of everything, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly is it presents a potential to create a lot of personal wealth. The landowners are making, in some cases, quite a bit of money. So there is certainly an economic component to this that is different than, for example, what happened under the coal regime. But I think basically the perils are the same, and the demands on public policy, the demands on government are very similar. And it requires us to be thoughtful and prospective and accounting for all of the risks, and then to respond to those risks and to regulate a very powerful, very well-heeled industry.
So let's turn the clock back a little bit. You're working with Governor Rendell, and the first Marcellus well was drilled when, in 2004?
About 2004.
2004. And this industry has seemed to, fast and furious, has really come onto the state fast and furious. Was Pennsylvania ready for this at that time? Or when you, just give us kind of like an inside view, a fly-on-the-wall view of what was happening within the cabinet when this whole play started to develop?
Well, I don't know that I can fairly characterize what was happening in the cabinet, because that's not necessarily the way the administration functioned. But what I can say, and at least give you my opinion, is that we have had gas drilling in this state for probably 70 years. shallow gas drilling. We have a set of regulations, a set of laws that govern that activity. And that set of laws was the only defense for Pennsylvania when this new technology, which is completely different from shallow gas, swept into the state. And the scale and the pace at which this industry came to the state caught everybody, I think it's fair to say, by surprise. And certainly for the last several years, the state was in a furious effort to play catch-up, to get our regulations, our enforcement, our understanding of this new technology up to speed and get it to catch up with the pace of the industry. It is fair to say that while fracking is not a new technology and has been around for decades, this particular horizontal fracking is being applied to eastern United States landforms here in Pennsylvania for the first time. So we have a lot to learn. There are a lot of unknowns, a lot of questions that are raised, and our regulatory framework needs to catch up to this technology and to understand all of the complications.
The Oil Gas Act, the last time it was amended was in '84?
Roughly.
And so is there any interest at this point to update the Act to accommodate Marcellus and also the citizens of the state?
Well, there's a tremendous interest in updating the law. In the last 2 years, some very significant regulations were passed. And I think it's fair to say that as we sit here tonight, Pennsylvania is actually the strongest state regulator of gas drilling of any state in the United States. But I don't think our regulations are strong enough. And we have more work to do, and that's really the challenge facing the state.
Jordan?
Yeah, I'm curious about, John, what you base that on. We're looking at what's going on at the Delaware River Basin Commission, which is proposing new regulations, and there's a series of expert reports who have compared what the regulations are in Pennsylvania versus what they are in other states. What we're dealing with here in Pennsylvania, people have been dealing with out west. They've been dealing with it in Texas. They've been dealing with it in Colorado and in other western states. And one of the things, for example, that we allow in Pennsylvania that they don't allow in other states is the burying of the waste. What happens is when they drill the hole, they bring up a lot of bad stuff. They bring up these cuttings, and it's from deep down in the earth, and it has a lot of naturally occurring radioactive material and other problematic elements. And in Pennsylvania, they're allowed to just bury it on the sites. So we're going to end up in Pennsylvania, because of what's allowed under the Pennsylvania regulations, with hotspots of this material scattered all over the state. The other thing that we're seeing in Pennsylvania is that even for the regulations that we have underfunded the Department of Environmental Protection, and the budget has been cut repeatedly over the last, and it goes back to the past administration, unfortunately, as well, understandably with the budget situation that we have. But we saw a 28% cut in the budget just a few years ago for DEP. We just recently were involved in litigation where we learned that for a gas drill, for approval of a gas well, the state regulators spend 35 minutes on average to approve a well permit. That's simply inadequate to give those regulations that we do have meaning. And what we found out is that even for a high quality watershed where this well was located, they didn't even consider the impact that the well would have on that watershed. This was a well that was also within the corridor of the Delaware River Basin, which was the first one to be drilled in that area. They didn't even consider, despite the requirements of the Oil and Gas Act, they didn't even consider the impacts on the Delaware River Basin. So we certainly do have good elements in our laws. They're not what they should be, and they're not being enforced. And that's largely because of the decisions that we have made as a society not to properly fund and not to properly regulate, and then to make sure those are enforced.
Thank you. Can I have your name and where you're from, please?
Yeah, my name is Jim Cosa. I'm a property owner on Baylor's Lake in Benton Township in Lackawanna County, Pennsylvania.
You have a question?
Yeah, I do. Several highly credentialed economists have said that when you consider what we stand to lose in the areas of tourism, farm receipts, dairy products, grapes and wine, hunting and fishing, and wildlife watching, we could actually lose 20 more than we stand to gain over the proposed 35-year duration of the Marcellus Shale play. How do you respond to that, to those projections?
John?
Well, I think that is something that absolutely needs to be considered. And I speak with some experience from my days at the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Our state parks, for example, return $10 to the local economy for every dollar that the state invests. And we have 117 state parks, and about half of those state parks are actually on top of Marcellus, and the state doesn't own the mineral rights on about 80% of parkland. So parks could be disturbed. In terms of the state forest is sustainably managed. It's certified as sustainably managed. It was the first state forest in the country to be independently certified. It's the longest certified forest. It supports at least 70,000 jobs in Pennsylvania.
The National Weather Service in Binghamton has issued a tornado warning for Bradford County in northeast Pennsylvania until 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. At 7:12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, National Weather Service Doppler radar indicated a severe thunderstorm capable of producing a tornado near Burlington, moving northeast at 30 miles per hour. The storm capable of producing the tornado will be near Burlington and Franklandale by 7:20 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 6 miles northwest of Monroeton by 7:25 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Towanda by 7:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Ulster and WYSOX by 7:35 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Rome by 7:50 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Windham and Warren Center by 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. When you can do so safely, please report hail or damaging winds to the National Weather Service by calling toll-free at 1-877-633-6772 or by email at bgmstormreport@noaa.gov. Precautionary/preparedness actions. If you are in the path of this tornado, seek shelter in a basement or an interior room, away from windows.
State are, and in the municipalities in the rest of the state, you're governed by one of the laws is the Municipalities Planning Code. One of the things that the Municipalities Planning Code says is that every community that has zoning needs to allow for reasonable development of mineral rights. And the way the courts have interpreted that so far suggests that a community could not do a complete ban. But what you can do through zoning, as you do with all other uses of the land, is you say, for example, industrial uses. You don't say we'll allow industrial uses everywhere. You don't allow industrial uses to go where you're doing farming activity or where you have pristine natural resources in your community. You don't allow industrial uses where you have a big residential community or in a village. You could do the same thing under Pennsylvania law as it relates to gas drilling. So you could say we're going to zone it. We're going to say you can do it here, but you can't do it there. So in effect, what happens is you have banned it, if people want to think about it that way. But really what you've done is you said there are places where this is appropriate and places where it simply isn't appropriate. And communities have that authority.
Isn't there currently a committee that's meeting now in Harrisburg to try to create one ordinance for the whole state?
Well, there is talk of that.
And what does that mean to municipalities?
It's a big threat to municipalities, and municipalities have banded together in the past whenever there have been threats out of Harrisburg to take away local control. Part of what it means to be a commonwealth is to have that local control. And Senator Scarnati has introduced a bill that would, and it's the first time that there is serious talk about impact fees or severance taxes, but what they're trying to do is use that to prevent municipalities from having local control. And they're saying that if you want to get these impact fees, you have to agree to adopt this model ordinance. And what the model ordinance basically is a giveaway to the gas industry to allow it to be effectively everywhere in the municipality without consideration of those local issues that is inherent in why we have townships. Because our local elected officials understand what's important in their community, what uses belong where and what uses don't belong there. And that shouldn't be dictated to them by Harrisburg.
Well, then what is, help me, John, you just said that this is really an important piece of policy. And I remember from the Rendell administration, he didn't want to do any regulations on the gas company because he wanted them to get seeded. He didn't want them to pull out, which is kind of funny.
Well, there was a lot of regulatory work done.
Yeah, but, I mean, but that was what was going around. I mean, was that true? I mean, he wanted it to get seeded. I mean, the gas isn't going anywhere, and there's great opportunity for economic development. But why was he just laying back?
Well, I don't think the governor at all laid back.
Okay.
There was a lot of arguments made by the industry that this was an infant industry, which I think that argument strains credulity, to put it mildly. The governor had to take into account a lot of advice, and he made an assessment of what he thought was possible. But what I will say is certainly, especially in the last 2 years of his administration, the state did incredibly important work and incredibly powerful work on the regulatory front. There was a lot of regulations that were pushed through over the objections of the industry. For example, the total dissolved solid requirement, there are setback requirements, a number of regulatory pieces of work. And in terms of enforcement, I also want to point out that while DCNR and DEP's budgets were cut pretty severely in the last several years with the recession, in terms of DEP, the enforcement is paid for by the permit fees. So while DEP's general fund budget was cut pretty severely, the enforcement staff more than doubled in the last 2 years. So there was a tremendous amount of resources put into enforcement.
There, yeah.
And that, frankly, is a myth that is put out by some opponents of drilling, that the enforcement factor was underfunded. And that, frankly, is not the case. None of that, however, says that we're where we need to be. The enforcement function of state government needs to grow year after year after year. I think the Corbett administration recognizes that, and certainly we have to be vigilant, and we need to tighten up these regulations and impose some new ones and go where the science leads us.
Okay, thank you. Your name?
Tracy Carluccio, Delaware Riverkeeper Network. I'd like to go to the question of the day. Will Northeast Pennsylvania, will Pennsylvania get it right this time? And I'd like to ask a question related to what John brought up earlier. It's a little early to tell. I would like to say I don't think it's too early to tell. I mean, if you look at the statistics in Pennsylvania in 2010, 2,766 violations were issued by DEP to permit violators. And those were just the ones that they caught. That's about 7 violations a day. I think it's pretty clear that communities are suffering from the way gas drilling is moving ahead. Isn't it time for a moratorium in Pennsylvania?
I'll give it a shot.
We'll give that one
Absolutely.
We'll give that one to Jeff.
It couldn't be more a perfect time for a moratorium in Pennsylvania. It is time to put the science first. You know, Northeast Pennsylvania, NEPA, there's another acronym that's NEPA. That's the National Environmental Policy Act. That's the national law that says we should put the science first. We should look at the environmental consequences of what we do before we haul off and do it. It would cost, there's been a criticism in the Delaware River Basin about, well, we can't afford to do an environmental impact statement. Well, number one, the law doesn't allow you to say I can't afford it. But number two, there's a very simple way to fund this. There's 7 million acres of land leased in Pennsylvania. If each lease paid less than $1 per acre leased, we'd raise $7 million to do a programmatic EIS. It's simple. Why don't we do it?
Well, that probably for the same reason it's not happening yet in Maryland. There's political opposition. There are states around us, like New York and Maryland, that are either have de facto or talking about legislative moratoriums. The simple fact is, in Pennsylvania, this activity is legal, it is permittable, it is permissible under our existing laws. And the industry swept in here hard and fast and has so far drilled about 3,000 wells. The projections are in the next 20 years as many as 60,000 wells are going to be drilled. In a perfect world, maybe a moratorium is something that is worth considering. I don't see it happening in Pennsylvania. I don't see the political will to stop this industry. Now, an accident can happen tomorrow. I mean, look at nationally. Exxon Valdez didn't slow down our appetite for foreign oil. The Gulf oil spill didn't slow us down at all either. I'm not sure what it takes to turn a ship like that. But unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. I think what we've got to do and what the essential task is here is to catch up as quickly as possible. I think it's possible to do that.
Well, for one thing, if the ship is adrift and we don't even take a hold of the wheel, there's no chance to turn the ship. It seems to me that before we screw it up any further than we have already, it is time for a timeout. It doesn't take a lot. As you said at the top of the show, Tom, that gas isn't going anywhere. It's been there for 400 million years.
And there is a side of there is a national security side to this. I mean, do you believe that? I mean,
well, I do believe that we're 70% dependent on foreign sources for our oil and gas.
Absolutely.
But guess where most of that comes from? It comes from Canada. Now, I'm not particularly worried about Canada declaring war on the United States, or vice versa.
If I may, I agree with John that it is a question of political will, and that means that when enough people say it's time to put a pause on this to make sure that we're getting it right, then it can happen. And so for those of us who get that we're not getting it right now, I think we have a responsibility to say it's time to wait. The gas is going to be there. It's not going to go anywhere. And if we want to talk about our energy independence, the longer we have it there, the more energy independence we have. It does not make sense to waste that resource now when we don't know what we're doing, but we know that we're not getting it right now. The other, just one quick element to it, is when we're talking about our national security, we also have to think about water. We don't want to be dependent on foreign countries for our water. Imagine that. You know, the fear that people have now about foreign dependence on oil. Imagine when we share that feel, when we really get what it means to have that dependence when it comes to water. That's what we're risking right now.
Okay. Well, we're going to go to the phones. Judy in Montoursville. Judy, you there?
Yes.
Hi, Judy. Welcome to the show.
Yes, this is a little offbeat of what you people are talking about.
Well, don't go too far offbeat. We have a lot to talk about.
Okay. I'm concerned about, I know like the gas companies are bringing a lot of money into the towns with their restaurants and hotel people making money. What I was considering and wondering about is what about the Medicare and the senior citizens and that own their own homes? Like instead of a lot of these guys going to motels, what about them renting rooms from these senior citizens and helping them out, and besides help the men out, be a lot cheaper than what they're paying at their motels?
That's a good idea. Well, they can post their houses on Craigslist, I'm sure. James at Harvey's Lake. James,
yes,
you there?
Tom.
Yes.
Hello, Tom. My question is, and just was brought up about water being so precious. I think that the question is with the projection of 30,000 wells in the state of Pennsylvania using between 3 and 9 million gallons to frack a well, of which only about maybe a quarter is retrieved. All this fresh water over a period of time is going to be lost. Now, the earth doesn't have an unlimited amount of fresh water. And the question of the quality of water is a big question.
So you have concerns with the quality of water. Is that what you're saying, James?
I'm concerned with the loss of water, fresh water. Once
Okay.
it's fracked at 5,000 feet down in the shale, it's lost forever for us.
I understand. I'm going to take a few more calls, please. Sure. Thank you, James. Elizabeth from Saylorsburg.
Hello.
Hi, Elizabeth. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question for your attorneys, if I may. As a potential leaser, if I were to sign a lease with a gas company and the gas company experienced a blowout and toxic chemicals were to reach neighboring wells, now, of course, these people would be upset, and they probably would form a class action suit and try to sue the gas company. Would I be liable as well because I signed a lease with this gas company?
It's a great question. So I think what a lot of people ask, if I own a piece of land, this comes up a lot. I have 100 acres, and I'm going to have some drilling activity on my land, and your property's next door to mine, and your land or well gets contaminated based on my activity, what happens?
Jeff, did you want to?
Well, it could be a nuisance. Under the law, you can recover for when a neighbor causes a nuisance that affects your property.
Your property value.
Your property value.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's an unintended consequence of this kind of activity is we're going to see people having an increasingly difficult time, whether they've leased their land or they live in an area where others have leased their land around them. they're going to have an increasingly difficult time of getting mortgages to buy properties or even being able to refinance.
So what happens? If you sue me then, if I have the well on my property, is that what happens? You wind up suing me?
Yeah.
And does the gas company will protect me though, won't they?
Well, it all depends on what your lease says with the gas company and what they have to indemnify you for and what they don't. And I don't know what the leases say on that regard.
So this is interesting. I think that in order to get it right, it sounds like a lot of the individual landowners that are leasing their property really has to have a strong lease, right? So I mean, back in the coal era, think about this, right? The coal companies owned the mineral rights, but in this case, individual landowners own the rights to that gas, and if they sign a crummy lease, then Pennsylvania or the neighbors is going to pay for it. Is that?
It's absolutely right.
So how do you? I mean, so how much land is actually signed in?
It's my understanding that about a quarter of the state has already been leased.
So if the quarter of the state's already been leased, how many of those leases are giving the gas companies their whatever they want, and how many are restricted to them operating in a clean way?
My experience is that the leases that have been signed so far are heavily weighted towards industry, and that wouldn't surprise anybody. That doesn't mean that people don't have power in the negotiations, but again, it is part of what people demand. And as long as people are willing to sign leases that are weak, then the industry starts to say, well, that's the standard. If you want us to come in, you want the money, you want the royalty payments, it's a race to the bottom. But again, the more people get organized, the more people, and you see it in places in Wayne County certainly, landowners have joined together to negotiate together.
And I understand the Northern Land Group has really a strong lease.
I haven't reviewed the lease, but certainly the more people you have banded together,
it was like
the stronger you're going to get.
78,000 acres, I think they leased, or 80,000 acres, and with that kind of power, they're claiming, it's my understanding, that they have really strong environmental protections in that lease.
Let me add a footnote to that, though, for a moment. Remember that when we're talking about these lease provisions and indemnity and warranties by the gas companies, all of that kicks in when something goes wrong. The question here is not, what do we do when it goes wrong? The question should be, how do we prevent it from going wrong? Can we make this program fail safe? Shouldn't the industry have the responsibility to demonstrate by overwhelming evidence that this process can be done safely? Not that nobody can find a situation where there has been contamination caused by the gas industry. They're the ones that are changing the environment. They're the ones that ought to be bearing the burden.
Can you say your name and where you're from, please?
Victoria Schweitzer from Dimmock.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a question for our panel?
I do. I think the question should be, when you've kind of jumped in on that, will the gas company get it right this time? And if they don't get it right, what is the repercussions? You have Chesapeake, 16 families with contaminated water. They didn't do it, but they will provide them with water. You have Dimmock with 19 families. That gas company didn't do it, but they'll bring us water. Both of these companies get to continue their operations in the state. So I have a question for all of you. What is the number? Is there a number of how many people will have to lose their drinking water before we get the attention on this, that maybe the gas company can't get it right in the geology of Pennsylvania?
Former Secretary Hanger said the number of people needed to make that happen was 1. Didn't happen that way, did it?
You did sign a lease?
Yes, I signed a lease in 2006.
And you're not happy with the lease?
I'm not happy. I don't think the gas drilling in itself is a bad thing, but I agree that with Jeff that it must be done correctly, but we shouldn't be experimenting to find out if it can be done correctly. And I am the canary in the coal mine. I will never drink my water, and no one in my neighborhood will ever drink their water again. You can take a water treatment system and you'll still get the bottled water delivered. Do you get it? The law in Pennsylvania is you will restore the water, right? They have to restore the water to its original or better, but that's not happening. So my question is, what is the number? How many people will have to endure this before we say, slow down? I was told by a DEP person that when I said, you know, will they cut back on the permits? And the DEP person told me only if the industry wants that. Isn't that the tail wagging the dog?
Thank you. How about we take another phone call? Furman from Shamokin. Furman, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Welcome to the show, Furman.
Yes, the one question I have is I live in the Shamokin area, and right up across, like, I'd say like half an hour away, there's coal mines where they caught on fire. And my question is, what happens if the gas line would catch on fire and would go down into the ground and burn, just like it does in the coal mine in this area? Then everybody loses everything, and they're going to do just like they did with the coal mine spot and take the people's houses away because they're on fire underground.
I don't think we're going to see underground fires with the natural gas because the gas is volatile. It's going to come out of the hole or out of the wellbore a lot faster than that flame front can move down. So I suspect we're going to see blowouts and big fires like we've seen in western Pennsylvania. When these things go, it's a spectacular fire event.
Mm-hmm. And Mark from Williamsport. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you. The reason why I called was I wanted to defend in some way the energy companies, and that is that there is technology being afforded all energy companies on reclamation of water. In 2011, 2012, there's going to be new ways of cleaning water. As it stands today, some energy companies clean almost 100% of the water that they take out. So I do want to say that the technology available is catching up, and Pennsylvania leads that in the U.S. So I applaud what the DEP and the government is doing watching the energy companies, because there has been improvements in that area, and there will continue to be. It's a capitalistic approach, and the solutions are a company will create solutions to make money to save our water.
Mark, do you work in the industry?
I do.
And so are you actually seeing this technology firsthand?
I am.
Very good.
Mark, what's the comparative economics between that technology and just using water once on a consumptive basis?
Well, the economics are you're better off cleaning the water right away, because if you use fresh water, you're going to spend tons of money on transportation.
So
you're
recycling water. You're recycling the water right on site then.
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm.
But Mark, I don't think that the Pennsylvania regulations under the Oil and Gas Act require recycling, do they?
No, they don't. But you have to understand that the energy companies are reaching out to the private sector, knowing that the citizens of Pennsylvania are scared, and they want to have a good system in place if they're going to conduct business for the next 30 years. So
well, how about if we stop things now, put on a halt, and get the technology developed to where it can be used at every well in Pennsylvania, not just one or two?
Well, that may be a very well-intent plan, but we need the experience, and we need the ongoing technology needs competition to breed excellence. I believe this nation has founded on it. I believe we'll get through this. I believe Pennsylvania will get through this, and we'll have the finest, safest gas oil industry in the whole country.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you for that comment. Lou from Lehighton. Lou, you there?
Yes, Tom.
Yeah. Thanks for calling.
Sure. There is a documentary out there that shows the past practice of fracking with the gas industry. Most of it is taken out in Wyoming. with nothing but bad coming from it. Gas in people's wells, gas in neighbors' wells. It's out near the Grand Tetons, and evidently it poses a threat to Yellowstone, and anybody can go and look at it because it's actually on public land. The other concern that I have is that when they do try to filter the water with reverse osmosis, the ethers, there's over 350 chemicals in these substances that they can put down into the well to pressure out the gas. The ethers in there can actually eat through the membranes in the reverse osmosis and still contaminate your drinking water to the point where it eventually harms you. And lastly, my concern is that I believe it was in 2005, Dick Cheney signed some sort of bill that deregulated an awful lot of gas industry regulations, and it's my understanding that no matter what you do with your leases and your contracts, there is no recourse for the citizen. Can you address some of that?
Jeff?
Well, first of all, let's address the wastewater issue that you spoke about, reverse osmosis. That is a technology that can be used for some portion of the wastewaters that are generated by this process. But so far, the wastewater issue hasn't been answered effectively in Pennsylvania, or for that matter, anywhere else. Your conventional sewage treatment plant is not going to be able to treat these wastewaters due to the high salinity, due to the presence of biocides, due to the numerous issues associated with the chemicals involved in the process. And right now, we have no capacity to treat this wastewater in Pennsylvania.
So that's something that needs to be done. And as was it Mark from Williamsport was saying that the industry needs to work in order to develop these new technologies to balance the process.
And if we look at, he just quoted a figure, I think he said 90 or 95% recycle. The best recycle information I have is about 85% recycle, and most of the recycle technologies are down in the 40, 50, 60% range. That being the case, when you look at the amount of material involved, that's still a huge amount of residual that's left after you recycle. In other words, when you run the process through to rejuvenate the water to be able to reuse it, you get materials out of that are going to come out as a solid cake. And that material you have to figure out what to do with. Sometimes that's being applied to land for land farming activities. Now, of course, included in it will probably be radioactivity, organic compounds that are carcinogenic, such as benzene, and metals that are carcinogenic, such as radon and chromium and other toxic chemicals. We don't know what all of the mix is because the industry won't say what they use.
But how do you know that these chemicals are currently in that mix that comes up? How do you personally know that?
There has been some information released by the state of Pennsylvania, and there was a good deal of information collected by New York State in their generic environmental impact statement that they put out, their draft statement. We also have a number of toxicologists and expert chemists that have been looking into this issue, and we've identified Dr. Theo Coburn from Colorado has identified something on the order of 600 different chemicals that are being used in the fracking process.
Okay. Can you state your name, where you're from, please?
My name's Nicole Jacobs. I'm from Hughesville, Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to speak to what Mark had said and what you guys are talking about a little bit more too. In the Williamsport area, 5 new treatment facilities have opened, 2 of which opened in the last week. So a lot of the companies are joining on board to go with 100% 100% recycling of their water, which does predominantly happen on site to cut costs for the companies. I also wanted to bring us back to the issue of the moratorium briefly. Everybody wants to start a moratorium and have it in place, but we're looking at levels of unemployment that are below state minimums that we've seen in years. Bradford County's is down to about 5%, Tioga County's is around 6%, Lycoming County is around 7%, most of which is because the industry has come in and offered jobs where jobs weren't at before. If we were to put in a moratorium, what are we going to do to provide our local citizens with those jobs that they'll be losing?
Well,
thank you,
John. If you want to address it, but just briefly on the first question about the water, I do think that there is some confusion about how our water resources are affected. one way that they're affected is how the wastewater is handled and whether it's properly treated. The other way it's affected is by the drilling process itself. What we're doing is we're drilling through the aquifers, and we're creating a pathway for the methane and the radioactive material that is deeper than where the aquifers are to merge with our aquifers and to taint our water supplies. And so that's a different problem that we have with our water quality, separate and apart from the problems that we have with how do we handle the wastewaters that are generated through the drilling process. And once those aquifers are damaged, as happened in Dimmock, there is no technology that restores them. Those are our natural resources that are shared by all Pennsylvanians, that all Pennsylvanians, both those who live here and those who do business here, are dependent on. So when we talk about the economics and we talk about people's jobs, we also have to ask, how are people going to survive when they don't have clean water to drink? What's going to be the economic impact on our other industries when they can't use the groundwater that they've been dependent on? And every industry that exists in Pennsylvania now is dependent on clean water. So we have to conduct a real thorough look at what we're talking about when we're talking about the economics. And perhaps that should be a subject for another show. There are economists on both sides who I'm sure are available who can talk about the full range of economic impacts.
Mm-hmm. John, the leasing of our state forest and our state parks, do we have a good lease?
Well, I'll say first of all, we do. In fact, the Commonwealth has, I think, probably the most protective public land lease in the country. It's a 74-page document. We strengthened it significantly over the last 5 or 6 years. And the land that is leased of the state forest, where the Commonwealth owns the mineral rights, I think sets the bar very high in terms of environmental protection. The Commonwealth does not own about 15% of the state forest in terms of the mineral rights.
And conservation.
We don't own 80% of state parkland when it comes to mineral rights.
What are they? Are they conservancy lands?
No,
are they private?
basically they're privately owned. In the history of how the state park system was accumulated over the last 50 or 60 years, the Commonwealth bought what was available in many cases. There was some absolutely glorious land, but the mineral rights weren't available. They were previously sold off. The mineral estate has been severed from the surface in most counties of Pennsylvania for 100 years, and that's a legacy of coal. So the state, in most cases, bought what was available, and in terms of the state parks, we only own about 1/5 of the land area of the state parks.
So
outright.
Does that mean if I own the mineral rights under a state park, Ricketts Glen, I can extract that?
You have in Pennsylvania, the law says that the owner of the mineral estate has primacy. Now, when it comes to state, there's been no leasing of state parkland. There is, however, some exploration and some interest in developing mineral rights underneath state parks. We've obviously leased some state forest land. Where DCNR has control, the agency imposes that lease. Where the state doesn't own the mineral rights, the agency attempts to work it out with the owner of the mineral estate and enter into what's called the surface use agreement, which essentially mimics all of the environmental protections of that lease. So I will tell you that DCNR does an outstanding job of protecting the state's natural resources on the public lands. In almost every case, the agency has been able to work it out with the owners of the mineral estate. We went to court once and lost in a case called Belden and Blake, and that was where the state Supreme Court ruled that DCNR's only remedy at law was to sue after the fact if somebody damaged, for example, a state park. The agency strives not to get into that situation. The agency strives to work it out beforehand to minimize the impact of mineral exploration on the public lands. And I think it's fair to say that the agency does that as well or better than any public agency in the country. But that does not mean that it's not challenging. It's extremely challenging, and it will be more so challenging in the coming years as more interest is shown in the public lands.
And the fast and furious, we talked about how the industries really come into Pennsylvania, and obviously they have the technology to extract gas, and they're moving at a very fast rate, faster than the state can keep up with the industry. Is that correct?
Well, I think certainly in the early days, absolutely it was faster. I think it's for everybody to decide whether or not the state government is keeping pace. I mean, that's a primary role of every citizen in this Commonwealth. Every one of us in your audience here tonight, everyone looking at this program tonight, has a stake in this state getting it right. And they've all got to take a look at what's going on and judge for themselves.
Okay, okay, yes.
Yes.
Say your name and where you're from.
Duke from Dallas.
We have about 5 minutes, so if you please.
Okay. I'd like to take note that the #1 industry in the state is agriculture, of which 90% of the profits stay in the state. Now with Chesapeake and many other gas drilling companies now owned by foreign corporations, Chesapeake controlling interest is by the Chinese National Energy Company, I'm worried that with the pollution and the ruining of the agriculture, we're not only going to get it wrong this time, that we could stand to be a third world country in Pennsylvania, tax-free.
Well, I agree with you. The industry should be taxed. I think it's inexcusable that the industry has not been taxed. And there are many proposals at play in Harrisburg now. The industry absolutely should be taxed.
Okay. Talking about the legislation we referred to earlier that is proposing an impact fee, again, one of the risks in the way it's being proposed right now is that it would take away the ability of local communities to say, we're not going to allow drilling in our agricultural areas. So we need to have an impact fee or a severance tax, whatever you want to call it. We need to do it in a way that preserves local control so that we can continue to protect the agriculture.
Agricultural easements actually allow for drilling.
Many do.
Yeah, they do.
Many do. Some don't.
And well, in Lackawanna County, they do for sure. I know that. I want to take some phone calls. Walter from Springville. Walt, welcome to the show.
Listen, I have a question. I'm living right up here in the middle of all of this. We've got probably, I don't know, about 79 wells right next to me, including over in Dimick. The impact that I have seen so far is minimal. Yes, I understand that we have had a couple of wells damaged in Dimick, PA, but let me ask you, out of all of the wells that the gas company has drilled, how many people has it damaged? And then we want to put a moratorium on the gas wells, but we look at one oil well that explodes in the ocean that affects everybody, but we don't want to put a moratorium on them.
That's interesting. So how many gas wells have been drilled so far?
About 3,000.
And how many have been reported where there adjoining neighborhoods like Dimick have been?
Contamination, the figures I've seen is that the contamination rate is 0.57%. So that you have a problem. 5.7%. So you have a problem with groundwater contamination resulting from the drilling of 1 out of every roughly 17 wells.
But doesn't every industry have a casualty rate? I mean,
and that's why where we all agreed at the starting point is to do an assessment. Let's let science guide this so that we could figure out how you do this. First of all, is there any way to do it so you don't have a significant casualty rate? Because if we allow this to go on all around the state at that rate, with that level of contamination happening around the state, then we have lost Penn's Woods.
Well, I also think it's fair to point out, though, that all of this has happened prior to a new set of drilling standards being put into place in January of this year. So all of and there are absolutely heartbreaking stories. And one incident is too many. And there should be zero tolerance, but there is a new set of drilling standards that went into place in January. They've got to be enforced, they've got to be tested and see if they're even adequate enough.
So you come from the place, there is a balance between the industry and our communities.
I think there has to be.
You're saying there has to be. And how many wells do you think are going to be drilled in our region over the next 30 years?
Well, statewide, the estimate is 60,000 in the next 20 years.
60,000.
And this region happens to be the hotbed.
How many acres?
Well, 7 million are leased now.
7 million so far.
Okay.
It's a quarter of the land.
We're going to take another question. We have about 30 seconds here, okay? Your name and your...
Yes, I'm Vera Scroggins with Citizens for Clean Water. I'm in Susquehanna County, and our county is agricultural. There is no zoning, so they're able to build everywhere, which they're planning to do. Pipelines, well sites, compressor stations. There will be no spot that is not taken. We don't have sections that are industrial zones. So I find that apprehensible and absolutely unacceptable, and we need a moratorium quickly, because there's so much damage in our state areas. Thank you.
All right, folks. We're gonna continue our conversation here, but we're gonna say goodnight to the people at home, and we'll continue to obviously talk about this topic of Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania. But thank you for joining us. Thank you.